Welcome, friends. Tonight we set out on a journey unlike any other. A tour of the resting places of some of the most beloved young stars America has ever known. These are the child celebrities, the teen idols, the young voices that lit up our screens, filled our radios, and captured our hearts before time took them far too soon. Some you grew up watching, others you watched your own children and grandchildren fall in love with. All of them left a mark on American culture that hasn't faded. So settle in and let's begin. Our first stop is a place that practically invented the movies. Hollywood Forever Cemetery sits right in the heart of Los Angeles, its back wall sharing a fence with Paramount Studios. More than 100 years of show business history is buried on these grounds, and we'll be returning here several times tonight. But we begin with a voice that could make you laugh and cry in the same breath. One of the greatest entertainers who ever lived. Born Frances Ethel Gumm in Grand Rapids, Minnesota in 1922, she was singing on stage with her two older sisters by the time she was 2.5. The trio toured the vaudeville circuit as the Gumm Sisters, and by the time little Frances was 13, she had signed a contract with MGM and received a new name. From that point on, she was Judy Garland. Her breakthrough came in 1939 with The Wizard of Oz, a film that made her Dorothy to the entire world. She was 16 years old and already carrying the weight of a major studio on her shoulders. MGM kept her working at a relentless pace. Pills to keep her awake during 18-hour shooting days, pills to put her to sleep afterward, and a diet so strict that studio executives would snatch food from her hands if they caught her eating. It was a system designed to wring every dollar from a talented child, and it left scars that never healed. She made more than 30 films, received a Special Academy Juvenile Award for The Wizard of Oz, earned 2 more Oscar nominations for A Star is Born and Judgment at Nuremberg, and won 5 Grammy Awards. Her concert appearances in the 1960s were legendary, raw, electric affairs in which she poured herself out for audiences who adored her. She died in London on June 22, 1969, at the age of 47 from an accidental overdose of barbiturates. For nearly 50 years, Judy rested at Ferncliff Cemetery in New York. But in 2017, at the request of her daughter Liza Minnelli, her remains were brought home to Hollywood and reinterred here at Hollywood Forever, in a pavilion that bears her name. The space was designed so that her children and grandchildren can one day rest beside her. Her story touches almost everyone who hears it, because it is not really a story about show business. It is a story about what happens when a system designed to make money treats a child as a commodity. The pills, the manipulation, the relentless schedule. All of it was standard practice at the major studios in the 1930s and 40s. And Judy bore the worst of it. She spoke about it openly in her later years, with a candor that was unusual for the time. Despite everything, she never lost the ability to connect with an audience. Her Carnegie Hall concert in 1961 is still considered one of the greatest live performances in entertainment history, and the album recorded that night won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Not far from Judy Garland's pavilion, still within these same Hollywood Forever grounds, lies another performer whose childhood was defined by this town, though his story took a very different turn. If you grew up watching the Our Gang comedies, whether you knew them as Our Gang or by their television name, The Little Rascals, then you know Carl Switzer. You know him as Alfalfa, the freckle-faced kid with the impossible cowlick and the voice that could peel paint off a barn. Carl and his older brother Harold were spotted by producer Hal Roach himself when the two boys wandered into the studio cafeteria during a family vacation from Paris, Illinois, and broke into an impromptu song and dance routine. Carl was 6 years old. He appeared in dozens of Our Gang shorts from 1935 to 1940, and his off-key serenades to Darla became some of the most beloved comedy bits of the era. But once he outgrew the series, Hollywood had little use for him. He picked up bit parts here and there. You can spot him briefly in It's a Wonderful Life, and his photograph appears in White Christmas. But mostly, he drifted into other work. He became a dog breeder and hunting guide, counting Jimmy Stewart and Roy Rogers among his clients. On January 21, 1959, Carl went to the home of a man named Bud Stilts to collect a $50 debt related to a lost hunting dog. An argument broke out, and Stilts shot and killed him. Carl was 31 years old. A court ruled the shooting justifiable homicide, though not everyone who knew the details agreed with that verdict. He died on the same day as legendary director Cecil B. DeMille, whose passing dominated the next day's headlines. Alfalfa's death was barely a footnote. His grave at Hollywood Forever is a modest flat marker in the Garden of Memory section, easy to miss if you do not know where to look. It is a reminder that these child stars had entire lives beyond the roles we remember them for, even when those lives were cut short. Let us move across Los Angeles now to a much smaller and more intimate cemetery, Westwood Village Memorial Park, tucked between high-rise buildings just off Wilshire Boulevard. It's easy to walk right past it without knowing it's there, but this little patch of ground holds some of the biggest names in entertainment history. And one of the first we come to is a woman who started acting before she started kindergarten. Natalie Wood was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko to Russian immigrant parents in San Francisco in 1938. She landed her first tiny role at age 4, and by the time she was 8, she had charmed audiences in the 1947 Christmas classic Miracle on 34th Street, playing the skeptical little girl who isn't sure Santa Claus is real. She was one of those rare child performers who successfully transitioned into adult stardom, and not just any stardom. As a teenager, she was nominated for an Academy Award for Rebel Without a Cause alongside James Dean. She earned 2 more nominations, for Splendor in the Grass and Love with the Proper Stranger, and starred in some of the most iconic films of the 1960s, including West Side Story and The Great Race. She was married twice to actor Robert Wagner, divorcing him the first time and then remarrying him 8 years later. On November 29, 1981, during a weekend boat trip to Catalina Island with Wagner and actor Christopher Walken, Natalie drowned under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. She was 43 years old. The pallbearers at her funeral read like a who's who of old Hollywood, Frank Sinatra, Gregory Peck, Rock Hudson, and Laurence Olivier among them. She rests here at Westwood, in the same small cemetery as Marilyn Monroe. The investigation into her death was reopened in 2011 when the boat captain changed his account of that evening, and in 2018, the Los Angeles County Sheriff named Robert Wagner a person of interest. No charges have ever been filed. For those who remember Natalie as the little girl in Miracle on 34th Street, the little girl who grew up to be Maria in West Side Story, the unresolved questions add a layer of melancholy to an already sorrowful story. She was one of the few child stars who truly conquered Hollywood as an adult, and she did it with a grace and intensity that made her one of the most admired actresses of her generation. From the quiet of Westwood, let's travel north into the San Fernando Valley to the San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills. It's a Catholic cemetery on the grounds of the old Mission San Fernando, and it holds the remains of a young man who packed an extraordinary amount of living into 17 years. Ritchie Valens was born Richard Stephen Valenzuela in 1941 in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Pacoima. He grew up in a working-class Mexican-American family and taught himself guitar as a boy, fashioning his first instrument from a solid block of wood. By the time he was a teenager, he was playing in local bands and drawing attention for the way he could take a song and light it on fire. He was discovered by Bob Keane of Del-Fi Records, who shortened his name to Ritchie Valens and recorded his debut album in 1958. The hits came fast. Come On, Let's Go climbed the charts, and then Donna, a ballad he wrote for his high school girlfriend Donna Ludwig, reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. But the song that made Ritchie immortal was La Bamba, a rocked-up version of a traditional Mexican folk song that became the first Spanish-language rock and roll hit in the United States. He was barely old enough to drive. On February 3, 1959, the day that would become known as the day the music died, Ritchie boarded a small charter plane in Mason City, Iowa, after a concert as part of the Winter Dance Party tour. The plane also carried Buddy Holly and J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper. Minutes after takeoff, in the middle of a snowstorm, the plane crashed into a frozen cornfield. All aboard were killed. Ritchie Valens was 17 years old. He rests here at San Fernando Mission Cemetery, where visitors still leave guitar picks and flowers. He had been a professional musician for all of 8 months. In that impossibly brief career, he had helped invent a new sound, a fusion of rock and roll with Latin rhythms that would influence everyone from Carlos Santana to Los Lobos, whose 1987 cover of La Bamba for the Ritchie Valens biopic returned the song to the top of the charts nearly 3 decades after his death. The irony is that Ritchie was terrified of flying. A childhood accident involving a mid-air collision between 2 planes over his schoolyard in Pacoima, which killed several students on the ground, had left him with a deep fear of small aircraft. On the night of The Day the Music Died, he got his seat on that fatal plane only by winning a coin toss. We'll visit Buddy Holly later in our journey when we travel to Texas. But for now, let's stay in California and head south to Palo Alto, a quiet college town on the San Francisco Peninsula. This is a long way from the glamour of Hollywood, and that's exactly the point. Shirley Temple was, quite simply, the most famous child in the world. Born in Santa Monica in 1928, she started dancing lessons at 3 and was discovered by a talent scout not long after. By 1934, at the age of 6, she was the biggest box office draw in America, bigger than Clark Gable, bigger than anyone. During the Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt reportedly said that as long as the country had Shirley Temple, it would be all right. She could sing, she could dance, she could act, and she did it all with a dimpled smile and a head full of perfect curls that her mother set in exactly 56 pin curls every night. Films like Bright Eyes, Heidi, The Little Colonel, and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm made her an industry unto herself. Her likeness appeared on dolls, dishes, and clothing. She was Hollywood's first true child star merchandising phenomenon. But as she grew into her teens, audiences drifted away, and by the time she was 22, her film career was essentially over. Rather than chasing diminishing roles, she reinvented herself entirely. She married businessman Charles Alden Black, moved to the San Francisco suburbs, and entered public life. She ran for Congress in 1967, and though she lost, she caught the attention of the Nixon administration. She served as a United Nations delegate, then as the United States ambassador to Ghana, and later as ambassador to Czechoslovakia during the fall of the Iron Curtain. She was also the first woman to serve as Chief of Protocol of the United States. Not a bad second act for a former child star. Shirley Temple Black died at her home in Woodside, California, on February 10, 2014, at the age of 85, from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She had been a lifelong smoker, though she carefully avoided being photographed with a cigarette because she didn't want to set a bad example for her fans. She rests at Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto, far from the Hollywood she left behind. It is worth pausing here to note just how extraordinary her reinvention was. In an era when former child stars were expected to fade quietly, or worse, flame out publicly, she built a second career of genuine distinction. She was present for the fall of the Berlin Wall as the American ambassador to Czechoslovakia. She navigated complex diplomatic relationships during the Cold War, and she did it all without trading on her childhood fame. When asked about her movie career in later interviews, she was gracious, but matter-of-fact. She had been a child who worked, and then she grew up and did other things. It was that simple, and that remarkable. And now, one of the saddest stories on our tour. We leave the manicured lawns of Palo Alto and travel to a place that no longer exists, a pauper's burial ground on Hart Island in New York City's East River. Bobby Driscoll was the golden boy of Walt Disney Studios. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1937, he was discovered by a talent scout at the age of 5 in a barber shop. He was a natural in front of the camera, and Disney signed him, one of the first actors the studio ever put under contract. Bobby starred in Song of the South, Treasure Island, and So Dear to My Heart, and won a Special Academy Juvenile Award in 1950 for his performances in So Dear to My Heart and the thriller The Window. But his most lasting role was one that audiences never saw his face in. He was the voice and the physical model for Peter Pan in the 1953 animated classic. Disney used Bobby's movements to animate the boy who never grew up, which made it all the more painful when Bobby did grow up, and Disney let him go. Puberty brought acne and an awkward transition that the studio had no interest in managing. After a string of small roles, Bobby fell into drug addiction. He was arrested multiple times and served time in a California reformatory. By his mid-20s, he had drifted to New York City, where he lived in flop houses and abandoned buildings in the East Village. On March 30th, 1968, two boys playing in a deserted tenement found his body lying on a cot, surrounded by empty beer bottles and religious pamphlets. He was 31 years old. No one identified him. His fingerprints were on file because of his juvenile arrest record, but no one made the connection at the time, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in a city potter's field. It was more than a year before his mother, searching for him, learned from police that her son, the voice of Peter Pan, was already dead. He had been buried without a name, and to this day, the exact location of his grave is unknown. His story has become a kind of parable in Hollywood, the cautionary tale invoked whenever the industry's treatment of children is discussed. Walt Disney himself was reportedly shaken when he learned of Bobby's death, though by then the two had been out of contact for more than a decade. In recent years, fans have tried to locate his exact burial site on Hart Island, but the records from that era are incomplete, and the island, which served as New York City's Potter's Field for over a century, holds the remains of more than 1 million unclaimed individuals. The boy who gave Peter Pan his voice lies somewhere among them, unmarked and unvisited. Let's return now to Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, where we visited Natalie Wood earlier. Here lies another young performer whose life ended far too soon, and whose death seemed to carry a kind of eerie weight that went beyond the loss itself. Heather O'Rourke was 5 years old when Steven Spielberg spotted her in the MGM commissary. The little girl with the big blue eyes and the blonde hair caught his attention, and he cast her as Carol Ann Freeling in the 1982 horror film Poltergeist. Her delivery of the line, "They're here," became one of the most famous moments in movie history. She reprised the role in 2 sequels, appeared on television shows including Happy Days and the new Leave It to Beaver, and seemed headed for a long career in front of the camera. But in early 1987, she began experiencing health problems. Doctors initially diagnosed her with Crohn's disease. On the morning of February 1st, 1988, Super Bowl Sunday, Heather sat down at the breakfast table and couldn't swallow. Her mother noticed that her fingers had turned blue. Paramedics were called, and in the ambulance, Heather suffered cardiac arrest. She died on the operating table that afternoon. She was 12 years old. The real cause was a congenital intestinal abnormality, a stenosis that had narrowed her bowel, leading to septic shock. Her death, coming after the deaths of other Poltergeist cast members, fueled persistent talk of a poltergeist curse, though the real story is simply that of a medical condition that was misdiagnosed until it was too late. She rests here at Westwood, not far from Dominique Dunne, her on-screen older sister in Poltergeist. It is one of the most sobering coincidences on this entire tour. 2 young actresses from the same film, both gone before their time, both resting in the same small cemetery. Heather's mother has spoken over the years about the warning signs that were missed. Heather herself, even in her final moments in the ambulance, insisted she was really okay and worried about missing school. She was, by all accounts, a remarkably unaffected child who took her fame in stride and was proudest not of her movie career, but of being elected president of her 5th grade class. From the youngest voices in Hollywood, let's shift to one of the youngest voices in rock and roll. We travel now to the Bronx, to St. Raymond's Cemetery, a sprawling Catholic burial ground that sits in the shadow of the elevated train tracks. Frankie Lymon was 13 years old when he recorded "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" with his group The Teenagers in 1956. He was a kid from Washington Heights with a choir-boy soprano voice that could cut through any wall of sound. The song reached number 6 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart, making Lymon one of the youngest lead singers ever to top the charts. He followed it with "Goody Goody" and "I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent," and he and the teenagers appeared in the 1957 film Rock, Rock, Rock alongside Chuck Berry. But Frankie's voice changed as he grew into his mid-teens, and without that silvery soprano, the magic dimmed. He went solo, but the hits stopped coming. He struggled with heroin addiction through his late teens and 20s, enlisted in the Army briefly, and attempted several comebacks that never took hold. On February 27, 1968, Frankie Lymon was found dead on the bathroom floor of his grandmother's apartment in Harlem. He had died of a heroin overdose. He was 25 years old. After his death, 3 different women came forward claiming to be his legal wife, sparking a legal battle over his royalties that dragged on for decades. He rests at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, not far from the streets where he first learned to harmonize on a corner. In 1993, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a bittersweet honor for a young man who had seen almost none of the money his music generated. He was 13 when he stood in front of a microphone and changed popular music. He was 25 when the world forgot about him. Back in Los Angeles now, we make our way to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, a vast Catholic cemetery that has been the final resting place for Hollywood royalty since the 1930s. And here we find the man who started it all, the original child star, the first kid to become a genuine movie celebrity. Jackie Coogan was 4 years old when Charlie Chaplin saw him performing in a vaudeville act with his father and cast him as the abandoned child in The Kid, released in 1921. The film was a sensation, and Jackie became the most famous child in the world. He earned an estimated $3 to $4 million before he turned 18, an astronomical sum in the 1920s, and was so popular that his bobbed haircut became a nationwide trend. But when he turned 21 and went looking for his money, it was gone. His mother and stepfather had spent virtually all of it on fur coats, diamonds, and expensive cars. Jackie sued, and the resulting publicity led to the passage of the California Child Actors Bill in 1939, commonly known as the Coogan Law, which required that a portion of a child performer's earnings be set aside in trust. The law exists to this day, protecting every child who works in entertainment, all because Jackie Coogan's parents spent his fortune. In the 1960s, long after his career as a leading man had faded, Coogan found a second wind playing Uncle Fester on the television series The Addams Family, a role that introduced him to a whole new generation of fans. He died on March 1, 1984, at the age of 69, from heart failure. The Coogan Law, which his ordeal inspired, has been updated several times since 1939, but remains the primary legal protection for child performers in the United States. Under its current provisions, employers must set aside 15% of a child actor's gross earnings in a trust, commonly called a Coogan account, that the child can access at age 18. It is not perfect. Critics argue that 15% is far too low, but it exists because a little boy in the 1920s made millions, and when he grew up, there was nothing left. Every child who works in entertainment today, from the kid in a cereal commercial to the lead of a Disney series, owes something to Jackie Coogan. Staying with television for a moment, let's talk about a young actress whose show was one of the most watched family programs of the late 1960s, and whose story is one of the most cautionary in Hollywood history. Anissa Jones was born in 1958 in West Lafayette, Indiana, and moved to California with her family as a young child. At the age of 8, she was cast as Buffy Davis on the CBS sitcom Family Affair, alongside Brian Keith and Sebastian Cabot. She played the orphaned little girl who, along with her twin brother Jody, moves in with her bachelor uncle in his Manhattan penthouse. With her pigtails, her wide eyes, and her beloved doll Mrs. Beasley, Buffy became one of the most recognizable characters on American television. The show ran for 5 seasons, ending in 1971, and Anissa found herself at 13 years old with a career behind her and not much ahead. She resented the wholesome image the show had given her, and wanted desperately to be seen as something other than a little girl with a doll. She turned down roles and grew increasingly restless. On August 28, 1976, just 10 days after turning 18, Anissa Jones was found dead in the home of a friend in Oceanside, California. The coroner determined that she had died from a massive overdose of several drugs taken in combination. At the time, the Los Angeles County coroner called it one of the most severe cases of drug ingestion he had seen. She was 18 years old. Her remains were cremated and scattered at sea. Let us travel now all the way to the Pacific Northwest to a hillside cemetery in Seattle that overlooks Lake Washington. Lakeview Cemetery on Capitol Hill is one of those places where local history and global fame intersect in unexpected ways. The graves of Seattle's founding pioneers are scattered across these grounds, but the reason thousands of people visit every year has nothing to do with pioneers. Brandon Lee was born in Oakland, California, in 1965, the son of martial arts legend Bruce Lee. His father died under mysterious circumstances in 1973, when Brandon was just 8 years old, and the boy grew up in the long shadow of one of the most famous men who ever lived. As a young man, Brandon pursued an acting career of his own, appearing in films like Legacy of Rage and Rapid Fire. In 1993, he was cast as the lead in The Crow, a dark action film based on a comic book about a murdered musician who comes back from the dead to avenge his own killing. The film was shooting in Wilmington, North Carolina on March 31, 1993, when a scene called for Brandon to be shot at with a prop gun. Due to a catastrophic error in the handling of dummy rounds, a bullet fragment was lodged in the barrel of the gun, and when the blank was fired, the fragment struck Brandon in the abdomen. He was rushed to the hospital but died after 6 hours of surgery. He was 28 years old, just 5 years younger than his father had been at the time of his death. The accident that killed Brandon led to significant changes in the way firearms are handled on film sets, though it took another tragedy, the 2021 shooting on the set of Rust, which killed cinematographer Helena Hutchins, to bring the issue back to national attention. A passage from The Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles, which Brandon had planned to use on his wedding invitation, appears on his headstone. A meditation on how death's unpredictability gives us the illusion that life is inexhaustible. The Crow was completed using digital effects and stand-ins, and was released to both critical and commercial success. Brandon rests beside his father here at Lakeview Cemetery, the two headstones side by side on the hillside, visited by thousands of people every year who leave flowers, notes, and small tokens of remembrance. Brandon was just weeks away from his wedding to his fiancée, Eliza Hutton, at the time of his death. From the rain-washed hills of Seattle, let's make our way now to the green rolling countryside of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. In the city of Winchester at Shenandoah Memorial Park rests one of the greatest voices country music has ever produced. Patsy Cline wasn't exactly a child celebrity. She didn't become famous until her 20s, but she grew up performing. Born Virginia Patterson Hensley in 1932, she was singing in local talent shows and church choirs around Winchester by the time she was a teenager, and she dropped out of school at 15 to help support her family by working at a drugstore counter and singing in honky-tonks at night. Her big break came in 1957 when she appeared on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts on CBS and sang "Walkin' After Midnight," which shot to number 2 on the country charts and crossed over to the pop charts as well. But it was a string of recordings in the early 1960s that made her immortal. "I Fall to Pieces," "Crazy," written for her by a young Willie Nelson, "She's Got You," and "Sweet Dreams" established her as the foremost female voice in country music. She had a rich contralto that could convey heartbreak like nobody else. On March 5, 1963, Patsy was returning from a benefit concert in Kansas City when the small private plane carrying her, along with country stars, Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas, crashed in a forest near Camden, Tennessee. She was 30 years old. Her producer, Owen Bradley, once said that if Patsy had lived, she would have been the biggest female artist in any genre of music. It is hard to argue with that. Her influence can be heard in the work of Loretta Lynn, who was her close friend, as well as K.D. Lang, Reba McEntire, and virtually every female country artist who has followed. She was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1973, only the second female solo artist to receive the honor after Kitty Wells. Her grave at Shenandoah Memorial Park still draws visitors from around the world, and her hometown of Winchester has embraced her legacy with a walking tour and a museum. Let's head back to New York now, to Westchester County, where Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne holds row after row of modest headstones on a gently sloping hillside. This is a working-class Catholic cemetery, and among its residents is a young man from the Bronx who became one of the most electrifying teenage actors of the 1950s. Sal Mineo was the son of Sicilian immigrants who made coffins for a living. He grew up tough on the streets of the Bronx, got thrown out of school at 8, and joined a street gang before he was 10. After an arrest for robbery, a judge gave him a choice: juvenile detention or acting school. His mother enrolled him, and it turned out the kid was a natural. He appeared on Broadway in The Rose Tattoo and then in The King and I, working with Yul Brynner. In 1955, at the age of 16, he was cast as Plato in Rebel Without a Cause, alongside James Dean and Natalie Wood, whom we visited earlier tonight at Westwood. Plato was a lonely, sensitive teenager desperate for connection, and Mineo played him with a vulnerability that stunned audiences. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor at 17, making him one of the youngest Oscar nominees in history. He earned a second nomination for Exodus in 1960, and also had a brief career as a pop singer, with his single Start Movin' reaching the top 10. But as he moved into his 20s, the roles dried up. On the night of February 12, 1976, Sal was returning to his West Hollywood apartment after a play rehearsal when he was stabbed in the heart during what police eventually determined was a random robbery. He was 37 years old. His killer, Lionel Ray Williams, was not convicted until 3 years later. Sal Mineo rests here at Gate of Heaven, in the same cemetery as several of his fellow Italian-American New Yorkers, far from the Hollywood lights. His 2 Academy Award nominations, his Golden Globe win for Exodus, his top 10 hit record, all of it would have been enough to sustain most careers. But the 1960s were unkind to the teen idols of the 50s, and Sal found himself competing for roles against a new generation of actors. He directed a groundbreaking stage production of Fortune and Men's Eyes in 1969, which dealt openly with homosexuality in prison, a daring choice at the time. In many ways, Sal Mineo was ahead of his time, and the industry was not ready for what he had to offer. Back to Hollywood forever now, where we began this journey. And this time we're heading into the Abbey of the Psalms Mausoleum, a grand stone building near the center of the grounds. In one of the upper corridors, we find the final resting place of Alfalfa's sweetheart. Darla Hood was the leading lady of our gang from 1935 to 1941, the only girl in what fans consider the classic lineup. Born in Leedy, Oklahoma, in 1931, she was discovered at the age of 4 by a casting director for Hal Roach Studios while performing at a hotel in New York City. She appeared in more than 50 Our Gang shorts, usually as the object of Alfalfa's off-key affections, though Darla herself later said she didn't care much for Carl Switzer off-camera, calling him a troublemaker. After leaving the series, she graduated from Hollywood's Fairfax High School with honors and carved out a respectable career as a singer and voiceover artist. She formed a vocal group called The Enchanters, performed in nightclubs from the Copacabana in New York to the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles, and became a sought-after jingle singer. For years, she was the voice of the mermaid in the Chicken of the Sea tuna commercials. She also reprised her Our Gang persona on the Jack Benny program in 1962, in a sketch where Benny himself played Alfalfa. In 1979, while organizing a reunion of the surviving Our Gang cast members, Darla went into the hospital for what should have been a routine appendectomy. During the procedure, she received a blood transfusion contaminated with hepatitis. The infection triggered heart failure, and she died on June 13, 1979, at the age of 47. She rests in the Abbey of the Psalms Mausoleum, not far from her old screen partner Alfalfa, whose grave is out on the grounds. Darla's death shocked the surviving Our Gang cast members and the community of fans who had grown up with the series. By 1979, the Our Gang shorts were enjoying a major revival thanks to television syndication, and a new generation of children was discovering Alfalfa, Spanky, Buckwheat, and Darla for the first time. Darla had been instrumental in organizing reunions and keeping the legacy of the series alive, and her loss was felt deeply. Fellow cast member Billy Buckwheat Thomas, upon learning of her death, said simply that she was an awfully nice person. It was a fitting epitaph for the little girl from Oklahoma who had been the heart of the gang. Now let's leave the mausoleum and step back into the California sunshine for a story that takes us far from the studio lots. River Phoenix was born River Jude Bottom in 1970 in Madras, Oregon, to parents who belonged to a religious group called the Children of God. The family traveled through Central and South America before settling in Los Angeles when River was a boy. He and his siblings, including his brother Joaquin, who would become an Oscar-winning actor, were performing on the streets to earn money before any of them were in school. River's first major film role came in 1985 with Explorers, but it was Stand By Me in 1986 that turned him into a star. He played the leader of a group of boys on a journey through the Oregon woods, and his performance had a depth and maturity that caught everyone off guard. He was 15. Over the next several years, he proved that his talent was no fluke. He earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for Running on Empty, played the young Indiana Jones in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, and delivered a fearless performance in Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho. He was also a devoted environmentalist, a strict vegan, and a musician who played guitar and wrote songs with his band, Aleka's Attic. On Halloween night, 1993, River was at the Viper Room, a nightclub on the Sunset Strip partly owned by Johnny Depp. He collapsed on the sidewalk outside after consuming a fatal combination of cocaine and heroin. His brother Joaquin's anguished 911 call was later broadcast on the news. River Phoenix was 23 years old. His remains were cremated, and his ashes were scattered at the family ranch in Gainesville, Florida. His death was a watershed moment for Hollywood's relationship with young celebrities and drug culture. It shattered the myth that youth, talent, and good intentions could protect a person from addiction. His brother Joaquin, who was just 19 at the time, went on to become one of the most acclaimed actors of his generation, winning the Academy Award for Best Actor for Joker in 2020. Joaquin has spoken rarely but movingly about River's influence on his own career and life, and the two brothers' trajectories, one cut short, the other ultimately triumphant, form one of the most poignant family stories in modern Hollywood. Speaking of days the music died, let us travel now to Lubbock, Texas. Flat, dusty, windswept Lubbock, out on the West Texas plains. The city of Lubbock Cemetery is a modest municipal burial ground, but it holds one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. Buddy Holly was born Charles Hardin Holly in 1936. The E was dropped from his last name due to a misspelling on his first recording contract, and it stuck. He grew up in Lubbock, playing country and bluegrass with school friends. But when he saw Elvis Presley perform in Lubbock in 1955, everything changed. Buddy formed a band, started writing his own songs, and within 2 years had produced a string of hits that would reshape popular music. That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, Oh Boy, Rave On, Not Fade Away, and Every Day. He pioneered the standard rock and roll band format of 2 guitars, bass, and drums, and he was one of the first artists to use studio techniques like double tracking. His thick-rimmed glasses became iconic. He was 22 years old and newlywed, married just 6 months, when the chartered Beechcraft Bonanza he was riding in crashed near Clear Lake, Iowa, in the early morning hours of February 3, 1959, killing Holly, Ritchie Valens, whom we visited at San Fernando Mission earlier tonight, the Big Bopper, and the pilot. Don McLean would later immortalize the date in American Pie as the day the music died. Buddy Holly rests in the city of Lubbock Cemetery, back in the town where he learned to play. In just 18 months as a recording artist, Buddy Holly had laid the groundwork for virtually everything that followed in rock and roll. The Beatles took their name partly as a play on his band, the Crickets, insects, like beetles. Bob Dylan was in the audience at one of Buddy's last concerts, and he later said that seeing Holly perform was the moment he knew what he wanted to do with his life. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Eric Clapton have all cited Holly as a primary influence. All of this from a bespectacled kid from West Texas who had been making music for barely a year and a half. Remaining in the realm of television for a moment, let's talk about one of the most troubled young women the medium ever produced. Dana Plato grew up in front of the camera. Born Dana Michelle Plato in Maywood, California in 1964, she was adopted as an infant and began modeling and acting as a small child. At 13, she was cast as Kimberly Drummond on the NBC sitcom Different Strokes, alongside Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges. The show, which ran from 1978 to 1986, was a ratings juggernaut, but behind the scenes, Dana's life was unraveling. She became pregnant at 14 by her boyfriend, and the producers, unwilling to write a pregnancy into the storyline of a family sitcom, reduced her role and eventually let her go. After the show ended, her life descended into a spiral of financial trouble, substance abuse, and legal problems. In 1991, she robbed a video store in Las Vegas using a pellet gun, for which she served a brief jail sentence. She made desperate attempts at a comeback, including a disastrous appearance on The Howard Stern Show in 1999, in which callers mocked her mercilessly. The day after that appearance, on May 8, 1999, Dana Plato was found dead in the motorhome of her fiancé in Moore, Oklahoma. She had died from an overdose of the painkiller Lortab. She was 34 years old. The coroner ruled her death a deliberate act. Her remains were cremated. The so-called curse of Different Strokes was really no curse at all. It was a predictable consequence of fame arriving before maturity, money disappearing before wisdom, and an industry that discards its young stars without a backward glance. Tragically, her son, Tyler Lambert, would also take his own life 11 years later at the age of 25. Still at Hollywood forever, let's walk across the grounds to pay our respects to a man who could reasonably claim to have been the biggest movie star of 1939, which also happened to be the year that gave us Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Mickey Rooney was born Joseph Ewell Jr. in Brooklyn in 1920, and he was performing in his parents' vaudeville act before he could walk. At the age of 6, he was cast as the title character in a series of silent comedy shorts called The Mickey Maguire Series, and the name stuck, literally. He legally changed his name to Mickey Rooney. In the late 1930s and early 40s, he was the #1 box office attraction in America, thanks primarily to the phenomenally popular Andy Hardy films, in which he played a wisecracking teenager in a small-town American family. He made 15 Andy Hardy pictures and was paired with Judy Garland, whom we visited at the start of tonight's tour, in a series of Let's Put on a Show musicals that were box office gold. He earned a special Academy Juvenile Award in 1939 and was later nominated for 4 more Oscars during his career. He served in the Army during World War II, entertaining troops alongside fellow soldiers. His personal life was turbulent. He married 8 times, but he never stopped working. In the 1970s, he returned to Broadway in the hit revue Sugar Babies, and he continued acting into his 90s. Mickey Rooney died on April 6, 2014, at the age of 93, making him one of the longest-lived child stars in history. He rests here at Hollywood forever, not far from Judy Garland, the girl he danced with all those years ago. Mickey's longevity in show business was staggering. His career spanned more than 88 years, from his first appearance in vaudeville as a toddler to his final film appearances in his 90s. He worked with virtually every major star of the 20th century, from Clark Gable to Cary Grant to Dustin Hoffman. His personal life was colorful. His 8 marriages included a union with Ava Gardner. But through it all, the essential Mickey Rooney remained unchanged. A small, energetic man with an enormous talent who simply could not imagine not performing. Late in his life, he testified before the United States Senate about elder abuse, revealing that members of his own family had mistreated and exploited him. It was a grim echo of the exploitation he had witnessed as a child star in the 1930s. Let us leave Hollywood now and travel south to the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas, where the warm Gulf breeze carries through the palms at Seaside Memorial Park. Here rests a young woman whose voice brought an entire musical tradition into the American mainstream. Selena Quintanilla was born in 1971 in Lake Jackson, Texas, the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Abraham, discovered her vocal talent when she was 9 and formed a family band, with Selena on vocals, her brother A.B. on bass, and her sister Suzette on drums. They called themselves Selena y los Dinos. Through the 1980s, the family toured the Tejano music circuit relentlessly, playing at weddings, quinceañeras, and county fairs throughout South Texas. By the late 80s, Selena was emerging as a major force in Tejano music, a genre that blended Mexican musical traditions with American pop, country, and rock. She won the Tejano Music Award for Female Vocalist of the Year 9 consecutive times. Her 1994 album Amor Prohibido sold more than 1 million copies and produced 4 #1 Spanish-language singles. She won a Grammy Award for Best Mexican-American Album. She was 23 years old, poised to cross over into the English-language market, and seemed destined for a kind of global stardom that few Latina artists had ever achieved. On March 31, 1995, Selena went to a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi to meet with Yolanda Saldivar, the president of her fan club, to retrieve financial records. Saldivar, who had been embezzling money from the club, shot Selena once in the back with a revolver. Selena ran to the lobby, collapsed, and was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. She was 23 years old. Her funeral drew 60,000 mourners, and her posthumous crossover album, Dreaming of You, debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, the first predominantly Spanish-language album to do so. Her grave at Seaside Memorial Park remains one of the most visited celebrity graves in the United States. Fans from all over the world make the pilgrimage, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. The 1997 biographical film Selena, starring Jennifer Lopez in the role that launched her own career, introduced the story to a new generation. And in 2020, Netflix released the series Selena, the Series, ensuring that her music would reach yet another generation of listeners. In Corpus Christi, she is not just a celebrity, she is family. Back in Los Angeles, let's make a stop at Inglewood Park Cemetery, a large and diverse burial ground south of downtown where movie history and everyday life sit side by side. Here rests another Our Gang alumnus, and his story is every bit as troubled as Alfalfa's. Scotty Beckett joined the Our Gang cast in 1934 at the age of 4, playing a character known simply as Scotty. He was in the series for several years, appearing alongside Spanky McFarland and Alfalfa, and was considered one of the more talented child actors in the group. After leaving Our Gang, he successfully transitioned to feature films, appearing in The Jolson Story, Battleground, and A Date with Judy. As a teenager, he played the young version of Al Jolson in The Jolson Story and its sequel, Jolson Sings Again, winning praise for his natural screen presence. But like so many of his Our Gang colleagues, adult life was unkind to Scotty Beckett. He struggled with substance abuse and had repeated run-ins with the law, arrests for drunk driving, carrying a concealed weapon, and drug possession. On May 10, 1968, he was found unconscious in a Hollywood nursing home where he had checked in 2 days earlier, suffering from what appeared to be a severe beating. He died without regaining consciousness. He was 38 years old. The exact cause of death was listed as a combination of barbiturate poisoning and the injuries from the beating, and the circumstances were never fully explained. His story illustrates a pattern that repeated itself among the Our Gang alumni: early fame, followed by a long and painful struggle with adult life. Of the major Our Gang players from the classic era, Spanky, Alfalfa, Buckwheat, Darla, Scotty, a disproportionate number experienced serious difficulties after leaving the series. Whether this was due to the pressures of early fame, the lack of education and socialization that came with growing up on a movie set, or simply bad luck, it was a pattern that Hollywood was slow to recognize and slower still to address. From the gritty world of fated child stardom, let's shift to the bright, rebellious world of rockabilly. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California, is one of several Forest Lawn cemeteries in the greater Los Angeles area, and here rests a young man whose guitar changed the sound of rock and roll forever. Eddie Cochran grew up in a musical family in Minnesota before moving to Bell Gardens, California, as a teenager. He taught himself guitar and was performing in local bands by the time he was 15. In 1956, he appeared in the film The Girl Can't Help It, alongside Little Richard and Gene Vincent, performing 20 Flight Rock, a song that a teenage Paul McCartney would later perform at his audition for John Lennon's band, The Quarrymen. Cochran's biggest hit came in 1958 with Summertime Blues, a brilliantly constructed teen anthem about the frustrations of youth that reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and has been covered by everyone from The Who to Blue Cheer to Alan Jackson. He followed it with Come On Everybody and Something Else, each one a masterclass in economy and energy. On April 17, 1960, while touring in England, the taxi carrying Cochran, his girlfriend Sharon Sheely, and fellow rocker Gene Vincent crashed into a lamppost on the A4 road near Chippenham. Cochran was thrown from the car and suffered fatal head injuries. He was 21 years old. Gene Vincent survived but was left with a permanent limp. Eddie Cochran rests at Forest Lawn in Cypress, a stone's throw from where he spent his teenage years. Eddie's influence on rock music extends far beyond his own recordings. Summertime Blues has been covered by virtually every major rock act of the past 60 years, and his guitar style, punchy, driving, rhythm-heavy, anticipated punk rock by 2 decades. Pete Townshend of The Who has called Cochran one of his primary inspirations, and the Sex Pistols chose Something Else as one of the few cover songs they ever recorded. Eddie was 21 years old when he died, and his music was about being young, about the frustrations and joys of teenage life. And he captured that feeling with a precision that has never been surpassed. Returning to Westwood Memorial Park, that little cemetery surrounded by high-rises that keeps drawing us back, we come to one of the most heartbreaking stories on our tour, and it connects directly to our earlier stop at Heather O'Rourke's resting place. Dominique Dunne was the daughter of writer and journalist Dominique Dunne and the sister of actor-turned-journalist Griffin Dunne. She was a promising young actress who had appeared on television in shows like Fame and Hill Street Blues. In 1982, she was cast as the oldest daughter, Dana Freeling, in the original Poltergeist, the same film that made Heather O'Rourke a star. Dominique was 22 years old, with her whole career ahead of her. On October 30th, 1982, just 5 months after Poltergeist was released, her ex-boyfriend John Thomas Sweeney came to her West Hollywood home and strangled her in the driveway. She was rushed to the hospital and remained in a coma for 5 days before being taken off life support. She was 22 years old. In a verdict that shocked and outraged many, Sweeney was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder and served less than 4 years in prison. Dominique Dunne, devastated by his daughter's death and what he saw as a miscarriage of justice, channeled his grief into a career covering high-profile trials for Vanity Fair, including the O.J. Simpson case. Dominique rests at Westwood, sharing this small cemetery with Natalie Wood and many others we have visited tonight. Her father, Dominique Dunne, wrote about her murder and the trial in a landmark article for Vanity Fair titled Justice, which launched his second career as a chronicler of crime and celebrity. He covered the Menendez brothers' trial, the O.J. Simpson case, and the trial of Robert Durst, always bringing to his reporting the perspective of a father who had watched the justice system fail his own child. Dominique died in 2009 and is buried near his daughter at Westwood. The proximity of their graves, father and daughter reunited in this small cemetery, is one of the most quietly moving details on our entire tour. We'll take a detour now to the Deep South, to the heart of Alabama. Montgomery, the state capital, is where you'll find Oakwood Annex Cemetery, the resting place of a man who was arguably the most influential country musician who ever lived, and who first stepped onto a stage as a boy of barely 14. Hank Williams was born Hiram King Williams in 1923 in the tiny community of Mount Olive, Alabama. His mother gave him his first guitar at age 8, and a Blackstreet musician named Rufus Payne, known locally as T-Tot, taught him the blues. By 14, Hank had his own radio show on WSFA in Montgomery. By his mid-20s, he was the biggest name in country music, writing and recording songs that would become the very foundation of the genre. Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Hey, Good Lookin', Cold, Cold Heart, Jambalaya, and I Saw the Light. His songs were covered by pop artists like Tony Bennett, who had a #1 hit with Cold, Cold Heart, proving that country music could cross over to the mainstream. But Hank's personal life was consumed by alcoholism, back pain aggravated by a spinal condition, and a troubled marriage to his first wife, Audrey. He was fired from the Grand Ole Opry in 1952 for chronic drunkenness and unreliability. On New Year's Day, 1953, while being driven to a concert in Canton, Ohio, Hank Williams died in the back seat of his Cadillac somewhere near Oak Hill, West Virginia. He was 29 years old. The exact cause of death was heart failure, likely brought on by a combination of alcohol and medications. He rests in Montgomery at the Oakwood Annex Cemetery, where his grave remains one of the most visited in country music history. His funeral drew an estimated 20,000 people, one of the largest public gatherings Montgomery had ever seen. The service was held at the Municipal Auditorium, and the crowd spilled into the streets. Ernest Tubb, Red Foley, Roy Acuff, and other country legends performed, and thousands of fans wept openly. He had been dead for barely 2 days, and already the myth was taking shape. The tortured genius, the singer who lived every word of every song, the man who burned so hot he could not last. Hank Williams was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame as one of its founding members in 1961, and his songs have been covered by artists in every genre, from Ray Charles to Norah Jones. Back in Los Angeles now, at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, not to be confused with the Forest Lawn in Glendale or the one in Cypress, which is nestled against the Santa Monica Mountains just above the Hollywood Bowl. Here, we find a young comedian whose brief career burned with an intensity that makes his loss especially painful. Freddie Prinze was born Frederick Carl Prutzel in 1954 in Washington Heights, New York, the same neighborhood, as it happens, where Frankie Lymon grew up. Freddie was the son of a Hungarian father and a Puerto Rican mother, and he mined his mixed heritage for comedy material from the very beginning. He was performing stand-up at comedy clubs in Manhattan as a teenager, doing 20-minute sets about growing up in a bicultural household. At 19, he appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and the audience response was so electric that Carson invited him back almost immediately. NBC cast him as Chico Rodriguez in the sitcom Chico and the Man, which premiered in September 1974. The show was an immediate hit, finishing third in the ratings its first season, and Freddie became one of the first Hispanic leading men on American network television. He was 20 years old. Behind the success, though, Freddie was struggling with depression and Quaalude addiction, exacerbated by the breakup of his marriage to Kathy Cochran. On January 29, 1977, after a night of phone calls to friends and family, Freddie Prinze shot himself in the head in front of his business manager. He died the following morning at the age of 22. He left behind a 10-month-old son, Freddie Prinze Jr., who would grow up to become a film actor in his own right. Freddie's death sent shockwaves through the comedy world and through the Hispanic community, which had embraced him as a groundbreaking figure. He was the first Puerto Rican American to star in his own network television series, and he had done it with a comedy style that celebrated rather than mocked his heritage. Jack Albertson, who played the curmudgeonly Ed Brown on Chico and the Man, was devastated and struggled to continue the show without his young co-star. The series limped on for one more season before being canceled. At the Hollywood Improv and the Comedy Store, where Freddie had gotten his start, fellow comedians mourned a talent that had barely begun to show what it could do. Not far from Freddie Prinze at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills lies a child whose story may be the most difficult one we encounter tonight, but it's a story that needs to be told. Judith Barsi was born in 1978 in Los Angeles, the daughter of Hungarian immigrants. She was discovered at a skating rink at age 5, mistaken for a child even younger than she was because of her small size. She began appearing in commercials, more than 70 of them, and landed roles in television shows like Cheers and Growing Pains, as well as the film Jaws: The Revenge. But the roles that audiences remember most are the ones they never saw her in. Judith was the voice of Ducky in the 1988 animated film The Land Before Time and Anne-Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. Her cheerful voice, her catchphrase, "Yep, yep, yep," as Ducky, and her natural warmth brought those characters to life in a way that still resonates with anyone who grew up watching those films. At home, however, Judith's life was a nightmare. Her father, Josef, was an alcoholic who became increasingly abusive and controlling as her career took off. He threatened repeatedly to kill his wife and daughter. Child Protective Services was called, but the case was never adequately pursued. On July 25, 1988, Judith Barsi shot and killed Judith and her mother Maria, set the house on fire, and then took his own life. Judith was 10 years old. Both All Dogs Go to Heaven and The Land Before Time were released after her death. She rests at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. Both The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven were enormous successes, and millions of children grew up listening to Judith's voice without ever knowing the horror that had unfolded behind the scenes. Director Don Bluth later said that working with Judith had been a joy. She was professional, enthusiastic, and had an instinct for voice acting that most adult performers never develop. The character of Ducky, with its sunny disposition and its trusting nature, was in many ways a reflection of the best of Judith herself. Her story has become a rallying point for advocates of child protection, and her name is invoked whenever the failures of the child welfare system are discussed. She was 10 years old, and the system that was supposed to protect her did not.
From the darkest corner of our journey, let us shift to a story of resilience and reinvention. We travel now across the country to the small mountain town of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where Coeur d'Alene Memorial Gardens holds the remains of an actress who won an Oscar before she was old enough to drive.
Patty Duke was born Anna Marie Duke in 1946 in Elmhurst, Queens, New York. Her childhood was anything but idyllic. Her parents were troubled, and she was essentially handed over to managers John and Ethel Ross, who controlled every aspect of her life, including her diet, her friendships, and her emotions. They changed her name to Patty, isolated her from her family, and pushed her relentlessly towards stardom. It worked, in the cruelest possible way. At the age of 12, Patty was cast as Helen Keller in the Broadway production of The Miracle Worker, and she reprised the role in the 1962 film version, winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress at 16. She remains one of the youngest competitive Oscar winners in history. At 17, she starred in her own television series, The Patty Duke Show, in which she played identical cousins, a technical feat for its time. But behind the scenes, Patty was battling what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. She struggled for decades with mood swings, tumultuous relationships, and substance issues before finally receiving the correct diagnosis and medication in her 40s. Once stabilized, she became a passionate advocate for mental health awareness, testifying before Congress and writing openly about her experiences. She was married 4 times. Her son is the actor Sean Astin, known for The Lord of the Rings and The Goonies. Patty Duke died on March 29, 2016, at the age of 69, from sepsis caused by a ruptured intestine. She rests at Coeur d'Alene Memorial Gardens in Idaho, far from the world that made her famous and nearly destroyed her. In her later years, Patty became one of the most effective advocates for mental health awareness in the United States. She wrote 2 memoirs, Call Me Anna and A Brilliant Madness, and her willingness to discuss her bipolar disorder openly helped destigmatize mental illness for millions of Americans. She served as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1985 to 1988 and was a tireless advocate for actors' rights. Her son, Sean Astin, has spoken eloquently about growing up with a mother who battled mental illness while also being one of the most famous women in America, and about the courage it took for her to go public with her diagnosis. And now, the other half of the Different Strokes story. Gary Coleman was born in Zion, Illinois in 1968, adopted by a forklift operator and a nurse. He suffered from a congenital kidney condition called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, which stunted his growth and required multiple surgeries and dialysis throughout his life. He never grew taller than about 4 feet 8 inches. But what he lacked in stature, he made up for in personality. The kid was a dynamo. Talent scouts spotted him in a bank commercial at the age of 9, and by 1978, at the age of 10, he was starring as Arnold Jackson on Different Strokes. His catchphrase, "What you talkin' about, Willis?" became one of the most quoted lines in American television history. For a few years, he was the biggest child star in the country. But as the show wound down in the mid-'80s, so did Gary's fortunes. He discovered that his parents and former business manager had mismanaged or spent the bulk of his earnings, a cruel echo of the Jackie Coogan story from 6 decades earlier. He sued and won a judgment, but the money was largely gone. His adult years were marked by financial struggles, legal troubles, a brief and troubled marriage, and a string of odd jobs, including a stint as a security guard. On May 28, 2010, Gary Coleman died of an epidural hematoma following a fall at his home in Santaquin, Utah. He was 42 years old. His remains were cremated. His manager later said that Jonathan had been deeply affected by the failure of his film Heart's War, which he had hoped would relaunch his career as a serious adult actor. The gap between the fame he had known as a teenager and the anonymity of his mid-20s proved to be a chasm he could not bridge. His death prompted a wave of grief among the fans who had grown up idolizing him, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the support systems, or lack thereof, available to former child stars navigating the treacherous passage into adulthood. Roddy was that rare thing in Hollywood, a child star who was genuinely loved by everyone who worked with him. Elizabeth Taylor called him the best friend she ever had. Kim Hunter, who played his chimpanzee wife Zira in the Planet of the Apes films, said he was the kindest man she had ever met. His collection of photographs of fellow actors, which he began assembling in the 1950s, is now considered one of the most important visual archives of Hollywood's golden age. He published several books of his photographs during his lifetime, and they reveal an artist's eye for the humanity behind the fame. Let's step back in time now to Hollywood's golden age and remember a young actress who won a special Oscar and then watched the world forget her name. Peggy Ann Garner was born in Canton, Ohio in 1932 and began modeling and acting at the age of 6. She appeared in several films as a child, but her defining role came in 1945 when she starred as Francie Nolan in Elia Kazan's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, playing a bright, sensitive girl growing up in a poor neighborhood in turn-of-the-century Williamsburg. Her performance was so moving and so unaffected that the Academy gave her a special juvenile award as the Outstanding Child Actress of the Year. She was 12 years old. But like so many juvenile Oscar recipients, Peggy struggled to find her footing as an adult actress. She took roles on television throughout the 50s and 60s, including a regular part on the soap opera One Life to Live, but never achieved the heights her early promise suggested. She married 3 times, worked in real estate and as a car saleswoman at various points, and battled cancer in her later years. Peggy Ann Garner died on October 16, 1984, in Woodland Hills, California, at the age of 52, from pancreatic cancer. Her remains were cremated. Peggy's story is one of the quietest tragedies on our tour. No scandal, no addiction, just a slow fade from the spotlight into the ordinary struggles of an ordinary life. She once told an interviewer that the worst thing about being a former child star was not the loss of fame itself, but the way people looked at you when they realized who you used to be. She carried that burden with dignity for decades, and she deserves to be remembered for more than just the Oscar she won at 12. From the story of a forgotten Oscar winner, we travel to Knoxville, Tennessee, and the Red Hill Cemetery, where a gifted but troubled young actor rests far from the Hollywood that briefly embraced him. Brad Renfro was born in 1982 in Knoxville and grew up in a working-class neighborhood where trouble was never far away. He was discovered at the age of 10 by a casting director who came to Knoxville specifically to find a real Southern kid for the lead in the John Grisham adaptation, The Client. Brad beat out more than 5,000 other boys for the role and appeared opposite Susan Sarandon and Tommy Lee Jones. He was extraordinary, raw, intense, completely believable. Roles followed in films like Tom and Huck, Sleepers, Apt Pupil, and The Cure. He had genuine talent and an unteachable screen magnetism, but his upbringing had left him vulnerable, and he began struggling with substance abuse in his teenage years. By his early 20s, he had been arrested multiple times and was working mainly in low-budget independent films. On January 15, 2008, Brad Renfro was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment from an accidental heroin overdose. He was 25 years old. His family brought him home to Knoxville, where he was buried at Red Hill Cemetery on the same ground where he had played as a boy. Now something completely different. We travel to the far northeast corner of the United States, to the small town of Holton, Maine, practically on the Canadian border. And here, in a modest cemetery, lies a girl who didn't become famous for singing or acting. She became famous for writing a letter. Samantha Smith was 10 years old in 1982 when she wrote a letter to Yuri Andropov, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, asking him whether the Soviet Union was going to start a nuclear war. To everyone's astonishment, Andropov wrote back, inviting Samantha to visit the Soviet Union. She went in the summer of 1983 and became an international sensation, a pigtailed American girl touring Moscow and Leningrad at the height of the Cold War, appearing on Soviet television, swimming in the Black Sea with Soviet children. She was hailed as America's youngest diplomat and a goodwill ambassador. The trip led to a brief career in entertainment. She co-starred in the television series Lime Street with Robert Wagner. On August 25, 1985, the small commuter plane carrying Samantha and her father back from a filming location in London crashed while attempting to land in Auburn, Maine in bad weather. Both were killed, along with 6 others aboard. Samantha Smith was 13 years old. She rests in Holton, Maine, where she grew up. The Soviet Union issued a commemorative postage stamp in her honor, and a statue of her stands in the state capital of Augusta. In a strange postscript, the Soviet Union named a mountain, a diamond, a flower, and an asteroid after her. She had become in death a symbol of the hope that ordinary people, even children, could bridge the divide between superpowers. Her story reminds us that celebrity is not always something thrust upon a person by Hollywood. Sometimes it comes from a simple act of courage, a 10-year-old girl writing a letter to the most powerful man in the rival superpower and asking him, with the directness that only a child can manage, whether he was planning to blow up the world. Back in Los Angeles now, at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, where so many of our journey's subjects have come to rest. This time, we're here for a young woman whose bubbly screen presence masked a fragile private life. Brittany Murphy was born Brittany Ann Bertolotti in 1977 in Atlanta, Georgia, but grew up in Edison, New Jersey, and later in Los Angeles. She started acting as a child, appearing in dozens of commercials before landing her first regular television role on the short-lived sitcom Drexel's Class. She went on to appear in Clueless as the new girl who gets a makeover from Alicia Silverstone's character, and that performance, funny, sweet, completely natural, put her on the map. Over the next decade, she built a solid career with roles in Girl Interrupted, 8 Mile, opposite Eminem, Don't Say a Word, Sin City, and the voice of Luann Platter on King of the Hill. She was also a talented singer who recorded several tracks. On December 20th, 2009, Brittany collapsed in the bathroom of her Hollywood Hills home and died. She was 32 years old. The coroner determined that she had died from pneumonia, complicated by severe anemia and multiple prescription and over-the-counter medications. Her death raised many questions that have never been fully answered. particularly after her husband, Simon Monjack, died in the same house from similar causes just 5 months later. The toxic mold theory, the conspiracy theories, the unanswered questions about prescription medications, all of it has kept Brittany's name in the headlines years after her death. But those who knew her best prefer to remember the actress, not the mystery. She had a gift for comedy that was rooted in genuine warmth, and she could break your heart without ever seeming to try. Her voiceover work as Luann Platter on King of the Hill, which she performed for over a decade, showed a comedic range that few of her film roles fully tapped. She was 32 years old, and the best of her career was almost certainly still ahead of her. Let us now cross the Atlantic briefly for one of the more unusual stories on our tour. East Finchley Cemetery, in a quiet suburb of North London, is not a place most American tourists would ever visit. But here rests a young Englishman who was part of one of the most beloved Disney films ever made. Matthew Garber was born in 1956 in Stepney, in London's East End. He was the son of a session musician and began acting as a child. At the age of 7, he was cast as Michael Banks in Mary Poppins, alongside his screen sister Karen Dotrice. The film, released in 1964, was a massive hit and remains one of the most cherished family films in cinema history. Matthew's Michael Banks, the mischievous little boy who flies kites and dances with cartoon penguins, became indelible. He and Karen Dotrice reunited for the 1967 Disney film The Gnome Mobile. But after that, Matthew stepped away from acting entirely. He had no interest in pursuing it further. He attended school, worked odd jobs, and traveled. In 1976, while on a trip through India, he contracted hepatitis, which developed into pancreatitis. He was rushed back to London, but the damage was severe. Matthew Garber died on June 13, 1977, at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He was 21 years old. Disney posthumously named him a Disney legend in 2004, honoring the boy who helped make Mary Poppins practically perfect in every way. His death at 21 was barely reported in the American press. He had, after all, been a child actor in a single film, and he had no desire for the spotlight. But for the millions of people who grew up watching Mary Poppins, who sang along with Let's Go Fly a Kite, and pretended to jump into sidewalk chalk paintings, Michael Banks was as real as any friend. That the boy who played him died so young and so far from the sound stages of Burbank adds a bittersweet note to a film that is otherwise pure joy. Let's stay with the 80s kids for a moment and head north to Toronto, Canada, where Pardee Shalom Cemetery holds the remains of a teen idol whose face was on every magazine cover of 1987. Corey Haim was born in 1971 in Toronto and began acting as a child, appearing in Canadian television productions before making his Hollywood debut. He broke through with Lucas in 1986, a coming-of-age film in which he played a brainy outcast with a crush on an older girl, earning high praise from critics, Roger Ebert among them. But it was The Lost Boys in 1987 that made him a star. Paired with Corey Feldman in a teen vampire thriller, Haim became half of The Two Coreys, a tabloid-friendly duo that defined late 80s youth culture. The Two Coreys appeared together in several more films and eventually in their own reality show. But Haim's personal life was shadowed by substance abuse that began in his teenage years. He later spoke publicly about having been abused as a young actor, an experience he credited with fueling his addiction. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, he worked sporadically, mostly in low-budget direct-to-video films, and made multiple attempts at recovery. On March 10, 2010, Corey Haim died at the age of 38 from pneumonia, with contributing factors including an enlarged heart and coronary artery disease, the cumulative toll of decades of hard living. His death came just 3 months before Gary Coleman's, meaning that two of the most recognizable child stars of the late 70s and 80s died within the same season. The coincidence was not lost on the entertainment press, which used the occasion to revisit the perennial question of what Hollywood owes its youngest performers. Corey Feldman, who had been Haim's friend and frequent co-star since they were teenagers, was shattered by the loss and has since become a vocal advocate for the protection of child actors, speaking publicly about the abuse he says both Corey's experienced during their years in the industry. Returning to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, where we visited Jackie Coogan earlier, we find the resting place of a young actress who brought one of America's favorite literary heroines to life on the big screen. Bonita Granville was born in 1923 in Chicago and was acting in films by the age of 9. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress at the age of 13 for her role in these three. The 1936 William Wyler drama adapted from Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour, in which she played a malicious schoolgirl who spreads destructive lies about her teachers. It was a performance of startling maturity from a child barely into her teens. She went on to star as the teenage sleuth in a series of 4 Nancy Drew films for Warner Bros. In the late 1930s, the first screen incarnation of the character who would inspire generations of young readers. As an adult, she married Jack Rather, a wealthy Texas oil man and entertainment executive, and pivoted from acting to producing. She was the executive producer of the television series Lassie for many years and became a prominent figure in Republican politics, active in the campaigns of Eisenhower and Nixon. Bonita Granville Rather died of cancer on October 11, 1988, at the age of 65. Her trajectory is one of the more unusual on our tour. From child Oscar nominee to Nancy Drew to executive producer of Lassie to Republican fundraiser. She proved that a former child star could build an entirely different kind of life, one defined not by nostalgia but by ambition and reinvention. She and her husband, Jack Rather, also owned the Disneyland Hotel and the Muzak Corporation, making them one of the more quietly powerful couples in the entertainment industry for decades. From one childhood favorite to another, let's talk about the boy who went fishing with Lassie. Tommy Rettig was born in 1941 in Jackson Heights, Queens, New York, and began acting as a small child. He appeared in several notable films in the early 1950s, including The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, a surreal musical fantasy written by Dr. Seuss, and River of No Return opposite Marilyn Monroe and Robert Mitchum. But the role that made him a household name was Jeff Miller on the television series Lassie, which he played from 1954 to 1957, from the ages of 12 to 15. He was the first of several boys who would play Lassie's human companion, and for many viewers, he remains the definitive one. After leaving the show, Tommy found it nearly impossible to get work as an adult actor. He enrolled in college, studied computer science, and eventually built a career as a software developer, becoming one of the early pioneers of computer-based real estate listing systems. He also had a well-documented struggle with drug use during the 60s and 70s. Tommy Rettig died on February 15, 1996, at his home in Marina del Rey, California, from natural causes at the age of 54. His pivot to computer science was remarkable for its time. This was the 1970s when personal computers were still years away from the mainstream, and the idea of a former child actor becoming a software pioneer was as unlikely as anything Hollywood could have scripted. Tommy's second career proved that the skills he lacked as an adult actor, patience, technical precision, the willingness to work in obscurity, were exactly the skills he needed in a new field. He found in technology the stability and purpose that show business had never given him. Back at Hollywood forever once more, where a bronze marker on the grounds pays tribute to a young actor whose career was just beginning to soar when it ended in the most freakish of accidents. Anton Yelchin was born in 1989 in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in what was then the Soviet Union. His parents were professional figure skaters who immigrated to the United States when Anton was an infant, settling in Los Angeles. He began acting as a child and drew attention early for his natural ability, appearing in the Anthony Hopkins film Hearts in Atlantis at the age of 12. He went on to build a career that was remarkable for its range. He played a young Chekhov in 3 of the rebooted Star Trek films, starred in the vampire comedy Fright Night, and gave a critically acclaimed performance in the indie thriller Green Room. On June 19, 2016, Anton was found pinned between his Jeep Grand Cherokee and a security gate at his home in Studio City. The vehicle, which was later found to have been subject to a recall for a confusing gear shift design, had apparently rolled backward down his steep driveway. He was 27 years old. His death resulted in a lawsuit against Fiat Chrysler and brought national attention to the design flaw that had contributed to hundreds of rollaway incidents. His parents established the Anton Yelchin Foundation to support young artists. Anton's death was particularly shocking because of its sheer randomness. He was not the victim of addiction or violence or illness, but of a mechanical defect in a consumer product. The Jeep Grand Cherokee he was driving had a monostable gear shifter that did not provide adequate feedback to confirm the vehicle was in park. More than 700 rollaway incidents had been reported before his death. His parents' lawsuit against Fiat Chrysler was settled, and the gear shifter was redesigned. His final film, the darkly comic Thoroughbreds, was released posthumously to strong reviews. Let's talk now about a child star who found a way out of show business, only to meet an even darker fate. Rusty Hamer was born Russell Craig Hamer in 1947 in Tenafly, New Jersey, and became a television star at the age of 6. He was cast as little Rusty Williams, the wisecracking son of Danny Thomas's character on the sitcom Make Room for Daddy, later renamed The Danny Thomas Show. The show ran from 1953 to 1964, and Rusty was a regular throughout its entire run, growing up before America's eyes. He was one of the first true child stars of the television era. After the show ended, Rusty tried to continue acting, but found few opportunities. He served briefly in the military, worked as a waiter and at various odd jobs, and moved to a small town in Louisiana, far from Hollywood. He struggled with depression and financial difficulties for years. On January 18, 1990, Rusty Hamer took his own life at his home in DeRidder, Louisiana. He was 42 years old. Danny Thomas, who had been like a father figure to him on set, was reportedly devastated by the news. Rusty's story is one of the earliest and starkest examples of what can happen when a child star's identity becomes inseparable from a television role. For 11 years, from the ages of 6 to 17, he had been Rusty Williams, Danny Thomas's wisecracking kid. When the show ended, that identity vanished, and nothing rose to take its place. He spent the remaining 26 years of his life searching for purpose in a world that remembered him only as a character on a screen. Speaking of young actors who found only sadness after the cameras stopped rolling, let's visit another story from the 1970s. Brandon DeWilde was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1942 and showed a preternatural talent for acting from an extraordinarily young age. At 7, he made his Broadway debut in The Member of the Wedding, opposite Ethel Waters and Julie Harris, and his performance was so astonishing that he became one of the youngest actors ever to earn critical raves on The Great White Way. But it was his role in the 1953 Western Shane that sealed his place in American film history. He played Little Joey Starrett, the farm boy who idolizes the mysterious gunfighter Shane, and his final cry, "Shane, come back," is one of the most famous moments in the movies. He was 10 years old. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, making him one of the youngest nominees in that category. As a teenager and young adult, he continued to work in film and television, but he never matched the impact of that one transcendent role. On July 6, 1972, Brandon DeWilde was killed when his truck struck a parked flatbed trailer on a highway near Denver, Colorado. He was 30 years old. He rests at Pinecrest Memorial Gardens in Kenner, Louisiana, where he had been living. His death was a particular loss because, unlike so many child stars, he had not fallen prey to addiction or despair. He had simply been unlucky. A truck, a highway, a split second. The boy who had called out for Shane to come back was never coming back himself, and the American cinema lost one of its most purely gifted young performers. Now let us cross an ocean one more time, this time to the south of France. Deanna Durbin was not born in France. She was born Edna Mae Durbin in 1921 in Winnipeg, Canada, and raised in Los Angeles. But France is where she chose to spend the last 5 decades of her life, far from the industry that had made her one of the most bankable stars of the late 1930s. Deanna was a teenage soprano with a voice of astonishing purity, who was signed by Universal Pictures at the age of 14. At a time when Universal was on the brink of bankruptcy, Deanna's films, starting with Three Smart Girls in 1936, were so successful that studio head Carl Laemmle Jr. credited her with single-handedly saving the studio. By 1946, she was the highest-paid woman in the United States. She made 21 films in total, all of them built around her singing, and she received a Special Academy Juvenile Award alongside Mickey Rooney in 1939. Winston Churchill called her his favorite actress. But Deanna was deeply unhappy with the wholesome image that the studio imposed on her, and with the relentless demands of fame. In 1949, at the age of 27, she simply walked away. She married a French film director, moved to a farmhouse near Paris, and never made another film, never gave another interview, and never looked back. She lived quietly and privately for more than 6 decades. Deanna Durbin died on April 20, 2013, at the age of 91, in the village of Neaufle-le-Château near Paris. She is buried in France, the country she chose over Hollywood. Her retirement remains one of the most complete and deliberate withdrawals in entertainment history. She gave no interviews, attended no premieres, accepted no awards. When journalist David Shipman tracked her down in the 1980s, she politely declined to speak and asked to be left alone. She had no regrets about her film career, she said through an intermediary, but she had no interest in revisiting it. In an industry that feeds on nostalgia, Deanna Durbin's refusal to look backward was as radical an act as anything she had done on screen. She had been the most popular actress in the world, and she walked away as calmly as if she were leaving a room. Returning to Los Angeles, let us remember a young woman who brought one of television's most iconic characters to life in the 1960s. Lisa Loring was born Lisa Ann de Cinces in 1958 in Kwajalein, a coral atoll in the Marshall Islands, where her father was stationed with the military. She began acting at the age of 4, and at 6, she was cast as Wednesday Addams in the original 1964 television series, The Addams Family. With her deadpan stare, her braided pigtails, and her unsettling calm, she created the template for a character who has been reimagined many times since, but has never been surpassed by those who grew up with the original. The show ran for only 2 seasons, but it has lived on in reruns and in the popular imagination for 6 decades. As an adult, Lisa worked sporadically in entertainment and faced personal struggles, including substance abuse. She appeared in several low-budget films and made occasional convention appearances, always warmly received by fans who remembered her as the original Wednesday. Lisa Loring died on January 28, 2023, at the age of 64 from a stroke that followed a period of declining health. Her death came during a period of renewed interest in the character of Wednesday Addams, thanks to the hit Netflix series Wednesday, starring Jenna Ortega. Lisa had expressed delight at the show's success and had been gracious about passing the torch to a new generation. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the character she had created at the age of 6 had taken on a life of its own. That Wednesday, Addams belonged not to any one actress, but to the culture. Still, for those of a certain age, Wednesday will always be a 6-year-old girl with braided pigtails and an unsettling fondness for her headless doll, and that girl will always be Lisa Loring. Still in the world of 1970s television, let's pay tribute to Lani O'Grady, who was born Lanita Rose O'Grady in 1954 in Walnut Creek, California. Lani came from a show business family. Her brother Don Grady was Robbie Douglas on My Three Sons, and she followed him into television. At the age of 23, she was cast as the oldest daughter, Mary Bradford, on the ABC family drama 8 is Enough, which ran from 1977 to 1981 and was one of the top-rated shows on television during its run. The show starred Dick Van Patten as a newspaper columnist raising 8 children, and its gentle, family-oriented humor made it a staple of 70s television. After the show ended, Lani's career stalled and she struggled with anxiety, agoraphobia, and substance abuse for many years. She attempted to rebuild her life, working as a talent manager and writing about her experiences. On September 25, 2001, Lani O'Grady was found dead in her apartment in Valencia, California, from an accidental overdose of prescription medications. She was 46 years old. Her brother Don Grady, who had navigated his own transition from child star to adult life with considerably more success, was devastated by her death. The two siblings had taken very different paths after their respective series ended. Don built a career as a composer and musician, while Lani struggled with the anxiety and depression that had plagued her since childhood. Their divergent trajectories within the same family illustrate a truth that runs through this entire tour. The outcome of child stardom depends on factors far more complex than talent or fame alone. Jonathan Brandis was one of those young actors who seemed like a sure thing. Born in 1976 in Danbury, Connecticut, he began modeling at the age of 2 and appeared in television commercials before landing his first film role. As a teenager, he starred as Lucas Wolensack in the science fiction series Sequest DSV alongside Roy Scheider, and he was featured in Stephen King's It, The Never-Ending Story 2, and Ladybugs. He graced the cover of every teen magazine of the early 90s and had a devoted following of young fans. But as he moved into his 20s, the roles became harder to come by, and the transition from teen idol to serious adult actor proved elusive. On November 12, 2003, Jonathan Brandis took his own life at his apartment in Los Angeles. He was 27 years old. His remains were cremated. His manager later said that Jonathan had been deeply affected by the failure of his film Heart's War, which he had hoped would relaunch his career as a serious adult actor. The gap between the fame he had known as a teenager and the anonymity of his mid-20s proved to be a chasm he could not bridge. His death prompted a wave of grief among the fans who had grown up idolizing him, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the support systems, or lack thereof, available to former child stars navigating the treacherous passage into adulthood. Roddy was that rare thing in Hollywood, a child star who was genuinely loved by everyone who worked with him. Elizabeth Taylor called him the best friend she ever had. Kim Hunter, who played his chimpanzee wife Zara in the Planet of the Apes films, said he was the kindest man she had ever met. His collection of photographs of fellow actors, which he began assembling in the 1950s, is now considered one of the most important visual archives of Hollywood's golden age. He published several books of his photographs during his lifetime, and they reveal an artist's eye for the humanity behind the fame. Another young actor whose success on a popular show couldn't shield him from what came after. Lee Thompson Young was born in 1984 in Columbia, South Carolina, and showed a natural talent for performing from an early age. At 13, he was cast as the lead in the Disney Channel series The Famous Jet Jackson, playing a teenage actor who leads a double life as both a kid and the star of a spy show. The series ran from 1998 to 2001 and made Young one of the first black actors to lead a children's cable show. He went on to appear in the film Friday Night Lights, the television series Smallville, and had a recurring role on the TNT series Rizzoli and Isles. On August 19, 2013, Lee Thompson Young was found dead at his apartment in Los Angeles. He had taken his own life. He was 29 years old. His co-stars on Rizzoli and Isles spoke publicly about their shock and grief. He was cremated, and memorial services were held in both Los Angeles and his hometown of Columbia. From the 90s generation, let's remember a young woman whose brief career included one of the great teen rom-coms of the Reagan era. Amanda Peterson was born in 1971 in Greeley, Colorado, and began acting as a child. At the age of 15, she was cast opposite Patrick Dempsey in the 1987 film Can't Buy Me Love, playing the popular cheerleader, Cindy Mancini. The film was a modest hit, but became a staple of cable television and home video, and Amanda's girl-next-door charm made her a teenage crush for millions. She appeared in a handful of other films and television shows, but by the early 90s, she had largely withdrawn from acting. She returned to Colorado, married, had a daughter, and lived quietly out of the public eye.
On July 3, 2015, Amanda Peterson was found dead at her home in Greeley. She was 43 years old. Her death was attributed to an accidental morphine overdose, and she had been suffering from a lung condition. Her death was barely reported in the mainstream press. She had been out of the public eye for so long that many people were surprised to learn she had ever been famous at all. But for the teenagers of the late 1980s, Amanda Peterson was the girl next door, the cheerleader who saw past the nerdy kid's exterior and fell for the real person underneath. Can't Buy Me Love was never a critic's darling, but it was an honest, warm-hearted film that captured something true about the anxieties of high school, and Amanda was the reason it worked. Heading back to the San Fernando Valley, we stop at Eden Memorial Park in Mission Hills, a Jewish cemetery where one of the original boy sopranos of Hollywood's golden age rests. Bobby Breen was born Isidore Borsuk in 1927 in Montreal, Canada, and was raised in Toronto before moving to the United States. He was a child singing prodigy with a pure, clear soprano that caught the attention of Eddie Cantor, who became his mentor and brought him to Hollywood. In the mid to late 1930s, Bobby starred in a series of musical films for RKO and Republic Pictures, including Let's Sing Again, Rainbow on the River, and Hawaii Calls. He was a direct competitor to Shirley Temple and Deanna Durbin, and for a few years, he was one of the most popular child performers in the country. His voice was so distinctive that it was later parodied in Bugs Bunny cartoons. Like so many child stars, he struggled with the transition to adulthood, but he managed to build a respectable career as a nightclub singer in Las Vegas and on the nostalgia circuit. He never achieved the kind of comeback that Mickey Rooney did, but he never stopped performing either. Bobby Breen died on September 7, 2016, at the age of 89. His career arc, from the heights of 1930s fame to the quiet obscurity of the Las Vegas lounge circuit, is one that many child stars of his era would recognize. But Bobby Breen navigated it with more equanimity than most. He never complained publicly about the loss of his childhood stardom, never fell into addiction or legal trouble, and never stopped loving the act of performing. In an industry littered with cautionary tales, Bobby Breen's story is quietly reassuring. A child star who grew up, made peace with his past, and lived to be nearly 90. That, in itself, is a kind of triumph. One of the darkest entries in the annals of child stardom takes us to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. Trent Lehman was born in 1961 and began acting as a small child. His most notable role was as Butch Everett, the younger son, on the ABC sitcom Nanny and the Professor, which aired from 1970 to 1971. The show, which starred Juliet Mills as a magical nanny who comes to live with a widowed professor and his 3 children, was light family entertainment that ran for 2 seasons. After the series was canceled, Trent found no further work as an actor. As a teenager, he withdrew from public life. On January 18, 1982, at the age of 20, Trent Lehman took his own life. He was found in the schoolyard of the elementary school he had attended as a child. From one of the saddest stories to one of the funniest characters on television. Ken Osmond was born in 1943 in Glendale, California, and started acting at the age of 4. He appeared in bit parts in several films and television shows throughout the 1950s, but the role that defined his life was Eddie Haskell on Leave It to Beaver, which ran from 1957 to 1963. Eddie Haskell was the two-faced best friend of Wally Cleaver, sycophantic and polite in front of adults, conniving and sarcastic behind their backs. He was one of the first great comic villains of American television, and Ken Osmond played him with such relish that Eddie Haskell has become a shorthand in American English for any overly polite person who is clearly up to no good. After the show ended, Ken tried to continue acting, but found himself hopelessly typecast. Rather than struggle against it, he made a remarkable pivot. He joined the Los Angeles Police Department and served as a motorcycle officer for 18 years, earning 3 citations for bravery. He was shot and wounded in the line of duty in 1980, but survived because the bullets were stopped by his bulletproof vest. He returned to acting in the late 80s,
reprising Eddie Haskell in the revival series Still the Beaver and its sequel, The New Leave It to Beaver. Ken Osmond died on May 18, 2020, at the age of 76 from respiratory complications. His story is one of the few genuine happy endings on our tour. He took the hand that Hollywood dealt him, a brilliant performance in a brilliant role, followed by crushing typecasting, and refused to let it define the rest of his life. He served his community, raised a family, and returned to acting on his own terms when the time was right. Eddie Haskell may have been a schemer, but Ken Osmond was anything but. Speaking of the Cleavers, let's remember Tony Dow, who was born in 1945 in Hollywood, California. He was a natural athlete, a junior diving champion, when he accompanied a friend to an audition in 1957 and was asked to read for the part of Wally Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver. He got it, and for 6 seasons he played the all-American older brother, navigating high school, dating, and the eternal menace of Eddie Haskell, with an easygoing charm that made him a quiet favorite of the show's audience. After Leave It to Beaver ended, Tony studied journalism and art, directed episodes of television shows including Babylon 5 and Coach, and became a respected sculptor whose bronze works were exhibited in galleries. He reprised the role of Wally in the revival series and remained close to his former castmates, particularly Jerry Mathers, who played the Beaver. Tony Dow was diagnosed with cancer and died on July 26, 2022, at the age of 77. His death was announced prematurely by his management the day before he actually passed, an error that caused considerable confusion and distress. Tony's life after Leave It to Beaver demonstrated that a child star could build a meaningful, multifaceted career without ever fully escaping the role that made him famous. He was Wally Cleaver to the public, but to the people who worked with him, he was a thoughtful director, a talented sculptor, and a devoted family man. Jerry Mathers, who had played his younger brother for 6 seasons and remained his close friend for 6 decades, spoke at his memorial with the kind of warmth and affection that cannot be faked. They had been television brothers, and they had become real brothers, and that is perhaps the best legacy that any television show can leave behind. From the classic television of the 50s and 60s, let us jump forward to the 2000s for a story that is achingly recent. Sawyer Sweeten was born in 1995 in Brownwood, Texas, one of fraternal twins. He and his twin brother Sullivan, along with their older sister Madeline, were cast as the 3 grandchildren on the CBS sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond, which ran from 1996 to 2005. Sawyer played Jeffrey Barone from infancy through the age of 9, growing up on the set with a cast that included Ray Romano, Patricia Heaton, Doris Roberts, and Peter Boyle. After the show ended, he stepped away from acting entirely and lived a quiet life. On April 23, 2015, while visiting family in Austin, Texas, Sawyer Sweeten took his own life. He was 19 years old, just 2 weeks short of his 20th birthday. His sister Madeline released a statement asking for privacy and expressing her devastation. Sawyer's story is a reminder that the effects of growing up on camera can be invisible and long-lasting. He had spent the first 9 years of his life on a television set, surrounded by adults who were not his family, performing a version of childhood that was scripted and directed and lit for cameras. Whether that experience contributed to his later struggles is impossible to know. But his death, the youngest person on our tour to take his own life, haunts everyone who remembers the bright-eyed little boy sitting on Ray Romano's lap on that soundstage in Studio City. Let us take a moment now to remember 2 more child stars of Hollywood's golden age whose adult lives took them in very different directions. Jackie Cooper was born in 1922 in Los Angeles and got into the movies the way a lot of kids did in those days. His grandmother, an actress, brought him along to the set. He appeared in several Our Gang shorts and then was cast as the lead in Skippy in 1931 at the age of 9. His performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, and for nearly 50 years, he held the record as the youngest person ever nominated in that category. He was also the youngest at the time to be nominated for any competitive Oscar. The studio famously manipulated him into crying on camera by threatening to shoot his dog if he didn't produce tears. Despite this traumatic introduction to the business, Jackie Cooper went on to have one of the most successful careers of any former child actor. He served in the Navy during World War II, directed dozens of episodes of television shows including MS*H and The White Shadow, and returned to the screen as Perry White in the Superman film series with Christopher Reeve. He died on May 3, 2011, at the age of 88. And then there was Roddy McDowall, who was born in 1928 in London and came to the United States during the Blitz, evacuated from wartime England at the age of 12. He immediately found work in Hollywood and became a child star with his performance as the young Welsh boy in How Green Was My Valley in 1941, and as the boy who befriends a wild horse in My Friend Flicka and its sequels. He was a beautiful child with enormous, expressive eyes and a natural sensitivity that made him perfect for sentimental roles. Unlike many child stars, Roddy made the transition to adult roles with surprising ease. He appeared in Cleopatra opposite Elizabeth Taylor, who became his lifelong best friend, and found lasting fame as the chimpanzee Cornelius in the Planet of the Apes franchise. He was also one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood, generous, kind, and famous for his dinner parties and his enormous collection of photographs of fellow actors. Roddy McDowall died on October 3, 1998, at the age of 70, from lung cancer. His remains were cremated. His manager later said that Jonathan had been deeply affected by the failure of his film Heart's War, which he had hoped would relaunch his career as a serious adult actor. The gap between the fame he had known as a teenager and the anonymity of his mid-20s proved to be a chasm he could not bridge. His death prompted a wave of grief among the fans who had grown up idolizing him, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the support systems, or lack thereof, available to former child stars navigating the treacherous passage into adulthood. Roddy was that rare thing in Hollywood, a child star who was genuinely loved by everyone who worked with him. Elizabeth Taylor called him the best friend she ever had. Kim Hunter, who played his chimpanzee wife Zara in the Planet of the Apes films, said he was the kindest man she had ever met. His collection of photographs of fellow actors, which he began assembling in the 1950s, is now considered one of the most important visual archives of Hollywood's golden age. He published several books of his photographs during his lifetime, and they reveal an artist's eye for the humanity behind the fame. Another Oscar-winning child star whose life was shaped by a single film role. Claude Jarman Jr. was born in 1934 in Nashville, Tennessee, and was a 10-year-old schoolboy with no acting experience when he was discovered in a nationwide talent search for the role of Jodie Baxter in the 1946 film The Yearling, starring Gregory Peck. The film, about a boy who adopts a fawn in the Florida backwoods, required a child who could act with the unselfconscious naturalism of someone who didn't know he was acting, and that's exactly what Claude delivered. His performance won him a Special Academy Juvenile Award. He appeared in a handful of other films, including Intruder in the Dust and Rio Grande with John Wayne, but by his late teens he had stepped away from acting. He attended Vanderbilt University, served in the Navy during the Korean War, and built a successful career as a public relations executive and arts administrator in San Francisco. Unlike so many child stars, Claude Jarman Jr. navigated the transition out of fame with grace and dignity. He died on January 11, 2025, at the age of 90. His passing was noted quietly in the entertainment press, but for those who love The Yearling, it marked the end of a connection to a film that captured something essential about the American experience. A boy, a wild animal, and the heartbreak of letting go. Gregory Peck, who played his father in the film, later called Claude one of the best child actors he had ever worked with. Coming from an actor of Peck's stature, that was no small compliment. Returning to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, we find the grave of a young actor who was part of one of the most iconic films of the 1950s, but whose later years remain shrouded in mystery. Nick Adams was born Nicholas Aloysius Adamczak in 1931 in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, the son of Ukrainian immigrants. He moved to New Jersey as a teenager and then to Hollywood in pursuit of an acting career. He was scrappy, ambitious, and not above crashing parties to make connections.
He became friends with James Dean, a friendship that was widely discussed in Hollywood, and appeared alongside Dean in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, the same film that launched Sal Mineo's career. Adams went on to star in the television western The Rebel, which ran from 1959 to 1961, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in Twilight of Honor. He also appeared in several Japanese monster movies, dubbing his own voice into the English-language versions. On February 7, 1968, Nick Adams was found dead in his Coldwater Canyon home in Beverly Hills. He was 36 years old. The coroner ruled the cause as an accidental overdose of sedatives and a natural paraldehyde-like substance, though the circumstances of his death have been debated by friends and biographers ever since. He was one of those actors who seemed perpetually on the verge of a breakthrough that never quite arrived. His friendship with James Dean, which we will encounter at our final stop, gave him a connection to Hollywood royalty. But it also cast him in a shadow from which he never fully emerged. His nomination for Twilight of Honor showed what he could do with a substantial role, but substantial roles were hard to come by for an actor who looked like a tough kid from Pennsylvania. He is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, not far from Jackie Coogan and Bonita Granville, two other child stars we have visited tonight. Let us travel now to Westchester County, New York, to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, the same cemetery where Judy Garland originally rested before being brought to Hollywood. Ferncliff is a large and notable mausoleum-heavy cemetery, and here we find the remains of a young woman whose star was rising faster than almost anyone else's when it was extinguished. Aaliyah Dana Houghton, known to the world simply as Aaliyah, was born in 1979 in Brooklyn and raised in Detroit. She began performing as a child, appearing on Star Search at the age of 10 and singing alongside Gladys Knight in a Las Vegas show at 11. At 14, she released her debut album, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, which went platinum. Her second album, One in a Million, established her as one of the defining voices of late 90s R&B, and her self-titled third album, released in 2001, debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and produced the hit Try Again, the first song ever to reach number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 based solely on airplay. She was also building a film career, appearing in Romeo Must Die and Queen of the Damned. On August 25, 2001, Aaliyah and 8 members of her entourage were killed when their overloaded Cessna 402 crashed shortly after takeoff from Marsh Harbor Airport in the Bahamas, where they had been filming a music video. She was 22 years old. Investigators later determined that the plane was carrying several hundred pounds more than its maximum load. She rests at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, in a private mausoleum. Her death at 22 robbed the music world of one of its most innovative young artists. Aaliyah's collaboration with producer Timbaland helped create the sonic template for late 90s R&B, and her style and artistic sensibility have been cited as influences by Beyoncé, Rihanna, Drake, and The Weeknd. For years after her death, her music was unavailable on streaming platforms due to disputes between her estate and her former record label. But in 2021, her catalog was finally made available digitally, introducing her work to a new generation of listeners who had only heard about her from their parents and older siblings. No tour of child celebrity graves would be complete without acknowledging the biggest child star of the modern era, perhaps the biggest of all time. Michael Jackson began performing with his brothers as part of the Jackson 5 when he was 5 years old, and by the age of 11 in 1969, the group had their first #1 hit with I Want You Back. 3 more #1 singles followed in rapid succession: ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. And young Michael, with his extraordinary voice and his electrifying stage presence, was instantly recognized as something special. His solo career, launched in the early 70s while he was still a teenager, eventually produced Thriller, the best-selling album of all time, and transformed him into the most famous entertainer on earth. He won 13 Grammy Awards, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, and invented a style of performance that influenced every pop artist who came after him. But Michael Jackson's personal life was marked by eccentricity, controversy, and isolation. He died on June 25, 2009, at the age of 50 from cardiac arrest caused by a lethal combination of medications administered by his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, who was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Michael Jackson is interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a private area that is not accessible to the public. The story of Michael Jackson as a child performer is, in many ways, the story of American entertainment in the second half of the 20th century. He was pushed onto a stage at an age when most children are learning to ride bicycles, managed by a father whose methods were, by Michael's own account, often harsh. The pressure he experienced as a child, the expectation that he be perfect every night, the loss of a normal childhood, the weight of supporting his family, shaped everything that came after. Whatever one thinks of the controversies that surrounded his adult life, the child who sang "I'll Be There" at the age of 11, who moved audiences around the world with his voice and his dancing, was a once-in-a-generation talent. His influence on popular music, on dance, on the very concept of the pop star is incalculable. And it all began with a boy from Gary, Indiana, who was pushed onto a stage before he was old enough for school. Dana Hill was born Dana Lynn Goots in 1964 in Los Angeles and was a working child actress from a young age. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as a teenager, a condition that would shadow her entire life. Her most memorable role was as Audrey Griswold, Chevy Chase's daughter, in the 1985 comedy National Lampoon's European Vacation. She also had a substantial career as a voice actress, providing voices for animated series including Gadget Boy and the PBS show The New Adventures of Madeline. As an adult, her health deteriorated significantly, and she suffered a severe stroke in 1996 that left her in a vegetative state. She died on July 15, 1996, at the age of 32, from complications of diabetes. She rests at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. Dana's story is less well known than many on our tour, but it is no less poignant. Her diabetes limited the roles she could take and the hours she could work, and it cast a long shadow over a career that might otherwise have flourished. She had genuine comedic talent. Her turn as Audrey Griswold showed impeccable timing, and her voice work demonstrated a versatility that few knew she possessed. She was 32 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life managing a disease that ultimately took everything from her. Now for a story from the world of rock and roll that has never been satisfactorily explained. Bobby Fuller was born in 1942 in Baytown, Texas, and grew up in El Paso, where he formed a band and started recording in his own home studio as a teenager. He moved to Los Angeles in 1964, and in 1965, he and his band, the Bobby Fuller Four, recorded "I Fought the Law," a song originally written by Sonny Curtis of the Crickets, Buddy Holly's old band. It became a top 10 hit and one of the most enduring garage rock anthems ever recorded, later covered by The Clash, the Dead Kennedys, and countless others. Bobby seemed poised for a long career. On July 18, 1966, he was found dead in a car parked outside his Hollywood apartment. He was 23 years old. His body was covered in gasoline, and although the official ruling was that he had died by his own hand, the circumstances were suspicious enough that many who knew him, including his family, have always believed he was murdered. The case has never been reopened. Let us make one more stop before our journey's final destination. At Valley Oaks Memorial Park in Westlake Village, California, rests another singing child star of Hollywood's golden age who lived long enough to see the world forget her name. Gloria Jean was born Gloria Jean Schoonover in 1926 in Buffalo, New York, and began singing as a toddler. She was discovered at the age of 12 and signed by Universal Pictures, which marketed her as a successor to Deanna Durbin, the studio's biggest female star, whom we discussed earlier. Gloria starred in a series of musical films in the early 1940s, including The Under Pup, If I Had My Way, opposite Bing Crosby, and Never Give a Sucker an Even Break, with W.C. Fields in his final starring role. She had a lovely voice and an appealing screen presence, but she never quite achieved the level of stardom that Universal hoped for.
After her film career faded in the late 40s, she worked as a hostess at a restaurant, a receptionist, and a cosmetics saleswoman. She lived quietly in the San Fernando Valley for decades, occasionally appearing at nostalgia conventions. Gloria Jean died on August 13, 2018, at the age of 92. She had outlived virtually every other child star of her era, and her quiet, uncomplaining passage through life, from movie star to working woman to retiree, embodied a kind of dignity that Hollywood rarely celebrates. She once said in an interview that she had no regrets about her film career and no bitterness about its ending. She had enjoyed it while it lasted, and when it was over, she moved on. In a world of dramatic exits and public meltdowns, Gloria Jean's story is a reminder that the most remarkable thing a former child star can do is simply live a normal life. Let us now remember a young man whose career in Hollywood was built on a single, unforgettable performance in a film that has become a cornerstone of the American cinema. Freddie Bartholomew was born Frederick Llewellyn Bartholomew in 1924 in Dublin, Ireland, and was raised by his aunt in London. He showed an early aptitude for recitation and elocution, and his aunt brought him to the attention of casting agents. In 1935, at the age of 10, he was chosen by David O. Selznick to play the title role in the MGM production of David Copperfield. His portrayal of the vulnerable, well-spoken boy navigating a Dickensian world of cruelty and kindness was so convincing that he became an overnight star. MGM signed him to a contract, and he went on to appear in a string of prestigious films: Little Lord Fauntleroy, Captains Courageous opposite Spencer Tracy, and Kidnapped. For several years in the late 30s, he was one of the top 10 box office draws in America, a 10-year-old competing with Clark Gable and Shirley Temple. His parents, who had largely been absent from his life, sued his aunt for custody once the money started flowing, leading to a protracted and ugly legal battle that, along with the Coogan case, helped draw public attention to the exploitation of child performers. As Freddie entered his teens, his career declined sharply. He served in the Army Air Forces during World War II and afterward worked in television production, eventually becoming an advertising executive at a New York television station. He stepped almost entirely out of the public eye. Freddie's story is in some ways the inverse of Jackie Coogan's. Both were exploited by family members who saw them as meal tickets. But while Coogan fought back publicly and changed the law, Freddie simply walked away. He married, raised a family, and lived the kind of quiet, middle-class life that his film career might have denied him. He attended our gang and child star reunions occasionally in his later years, always gracious and unassuming, a gentleman to the end. Freddie Bartholomew died on January 23, 1992, in Sarasota, Florida, at the age of 67. His remains were cremated. His manager later said that Jonathan had been deeply affected by the failure of his film Heart's War, which he had hoped would relaunch his career as a serious adult actor. The gap between the fame he had known as a teenager and the anonymity of his mid-20s proved to be a chasm he could not bridge. His death prompted a wave of grief among the fans who had grown up idolizing him, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the support systems, or lack thereof, available to former child stars navigating the treacherous passage into adulthood. Roddy was that rare thing in Hollywood, a child star who was genuinely loved by everyone who worked with him. Elizabeth Taylor called him the best friend she ever had. Kim Hunter, who played his chimpanzee wife Zira in the Planet of the Apes films, said he was the kindest man she had ever met. His collection of photographs of fellow actors, which he began assembling in the 1950s, is now considered one of the most important visual archives of Hollywood's golden age. He published several books of his photographs during his lifetime, and they reveal an artist's eye for the humanity behind the fame. And so, friends, we arrive at our final stop. We have traveled from coast to coast tonight, from Hollywood forever to the Bronx, from the Shenandoah Valley to the plains of West Texas, from the rainy hills of Seattle to a small town in Maine. We have visited the graves of children who sang, who acted, who danced, who wrote letters, who played guitars and drums, and made the world pay attention. Some of them lived long lives. Most did not.
All of them were famous before they had a chance to figure out who they were without the cameras watching. Our last stop takes us to a place about as far from Hollywood as you can get and still be in America. Park Cemetery sits on a gentle rise at the edge of Fairmount, Indiana, population around 2,500, surrounded by cornfields and soybean fields in the dead center of the state. It is a simple rural cemetery, flat markers in neatly mowed grass, a few trees, a wrought iron fence. And here, under a modest headstone, lies the young man who came to represent an entire generation's restlessness, rebellion, and yearning. James Dean was born in Marion, Indiana in 1931 and raised on a farm near Fairmount by his aunt and uncle after his mother died when he was 9. He was a restless, sensitive kid who acted in high school plays, raised livestock for 4-H, and couldn't wait to get out of small-town Indiana. He moved to New York, studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, and appeared on dozens of live television dramas during the golden age of television. In 1955, he burst onto the movie screen in East of Eden, directed by Elia Kazan, playing a troubled young man desperate for his father's love. It was a performance of searing emotional honesty that earned him a posthumous Academy Award nomination. Later that year, he starred in Rebel Without a Cause, the film that would define him for eternity. The red jacket, the switchblade, the anguished cry of a teenager who feels misunderstood by the world. His co-star in that film was Natalie Wood, whom we visited at Westwood early in tonight's journey, and Sal Mineo, whom we found at Gate of Heaven in New York. All 3 of them would die prematurely. Dean completed one more film, Giant, with Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson. And then, on September 30th, 1955, while driving his Porsche 550 Spyder to a racing event in Salinas, California, he was struck by another car at the intersection of routes 466 and 41 near Shalom. He was killed almost instantly. He was 24 years old. In death, James Dean became something he could never have been in life, a myth. He had appeared in only 3 major films, but those 3 films were enough to make him the symbol of youthful rebellion for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. His face has been printed on more posters, t-shirts, and postcards than almost any other actor's. He was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, both posthumously, a distinction no other actor has achieved. His body was brought home to Fairmount, and more than 3,000 people attended his funeral at a small Quaker church. He was buried here at Park Cemetery, a short drive from the farm where he grew up. His grave is among the most visited in the world. Visitors come from every continent year after year to stand at this simple marker in this quiet Indiana town and pay their respects to the boy who left the cornfields, burned brighter than anyone, and was gone before anyone was ready. And so our journey ends where James Dean's began, in the heartland, in the stillness, far from the noise of fame. We've traveled thousands of miles tonight, from cemetery to cemetery, story to story, and what we've found is not a catalog of tragedy, but a tapestry of lives lived intensely, sometimes beautifully, sometimes recklessly, always memorably. These were people who gave us something, a song, a performance, a moment, that we carry with us still. They were children first, stars second, and human beings always. May they rest in the peace that so many of them struggled to find in life. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.